Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. Today we're playing the Tartary Army Corps against Kestrel's Colonial Force, and the scenario is the new ITS scenario, Provisioning. Now, Provisioning is a bit of a weird one, not because the scenario itself is strange. It is, in almost every respect, basically just a very mildly dolled up version of supplies, hence the name. Provisioning is weird because it is the first attempt by Infinity to use what we might call radial deployments, where each player has a 24-inch radius deployment zone from their table corner, playing diagonally across the table. And that does some very interesting things to both range bands you expect to play, deployment zones you use, and how the game unfolds, which we'll talk about over the course of this battle report. But for now, let's jump into the lists. Now, the Tartary Army Corps are a faction that kind of leapt out to me when I first saw the rules for provisioning for a couple of different reasons. One of them is that there is nothing like the forward observer bonus in a scenario to get Ariadne juices flowing, but there are a bunch of other things that happen when you play the game across a radial deployment style setup that makes a bunch of the units that we have access to in Tartary Army Corps particularly interesting. And to start with, you will see this list is a total meme in almost every other context, by the way. But in the case of provisioning, I think there are some interesting things that have legs here. And the first of those is quad scouts. Now, scouts are kind of expensive by the standards of midfield mimetism skirmishers, and that's mostly because of the armament that they are packing. Scouts have Ohotniks, which have possibly the most forgiving range bands of any weapon in the game. It's a burst 2 T2 ammunition weapon, damage 6, which has a good range band from 8 to 32 and basically a zero range band outside of that. And that is not really a range band that under normal circumstances it's hugely useful on infiltrating pieces. Infiltrating models kind of by definition will usually be much closer to the enemy. But in a radial deployment setup, you are actually potentially a very long way away from some of the fights you might be taking, even with units that are in the midfield, and as a result, those Ohotnik range bands can, and in this game we'll see, will be really, really relevant. There are all sorts of weird and different attack angles that come up when you have such a wide midfield, right? Corner to corner, a 48 by 48 table has something like a 69-inch nice diagonal that creates extremely wide attack angles both across the table and then in angling toward your opponent's deployment zone. And so I kind of knew snap pick I wanted to take as many scouts as possible, and especially the mine layer scouts would be very relevant because only with infiltration, not with forward deployment, only with infiltration can you do things like get mines in place covering the furthest most supply boxes in this scenario. And so as a result, the goal with these scouts is to cover the outside boxes, have specialists potentially in place to grab and run back with the outside boxes, and to just take long shots across any of the angles that present themselves with those extremely flexible range band Ohotniks. We then have a single Ermandino. I'm going to need some engineers in this list, which will make sense when we get to the absolute meme trailer park that is the group 2 of this list. But we have one of two Ermandinos, the other in group 2, and then a 4-person link. Now, this link is very marginally scuffed, but I only have so many points due to other decisions that have been made in this list. We have Colonel Veronin. I am a big Veronin fan, but we did get partway through creating this list, and I made some decisions about whether I wanted to keep or cut him. I think you could cut him for a Line Kazakh lieutenant very easily, which would free up points if you wanted to spend those points on other things. But in this case, we took Veronin, and I had a particular use for his Strategos. We have a cheap conductor, just to be in the link. It can do whatever. It's not adding link bonuses, but it is present and it's deployment zone defense. A Line Kazakh forward observer, and a Frontovic multispectral visor level 1 with AP sniper rifle. Now, that sniper rifle is present again, well, firstly, because it's the only gun I could afford that could join the link, but secondly, this is going to be a game where there is potential to take very long-range gunfights because we're playing across the diagonals of the table, not straight up and down. That changes the maximum range bands you can fight with to actually be beyond even the good range of a sniper rifle in some cases. Again, the maximum range firefight you can take on an infinity table is just under 69 inches. And while the closest points between the two deployment zones are actually almost as close as they would be in a 16-inch deployment zone scenario, The possibility for very long-range weapons means giving yourself access to things like sniper rifles is going to be important. And so we have a linked front-of-vic multispectral visor AP sniper rifle. As long as Veronin is also in the link, we'll get the +1 special die, but this link is not intending to do much. It's mostly just a piece, a firepower piece that will operate within the deployment zone. Another thing kind of to note about radial deployment zones is that you have less deployment zone space. It's not the same as something like a Biotech Vor style 8-inch deployment zone. Those feel really difficult to play in, not because you have less space, but because you have less depth. In a radial deployment with 24 inches, you actually have a fair amount of depth. It's just that the space contracts and contracts, and so the total real estate you have to put models in is going to be relatively limited. And so things like infiltration and forward deployment will be very useful just for freeing up that space so you can make maximum use of the defensive depth that you have. This also makes skills like, for example, Sapper particularly useful, and this leads us into probably the most significant meme portion of this list, which is basically everything that's happening in Combat Group 2. Now, sensible things first, a couple of Strelocks, one forward observer and one mine layer. Now, as mentioned, you don't want to go ham on forward deployment 8 in this kind of deployment situation, because it's only going to give you access to a certain amount of the space in the infiltration kind of area. True infiltration is much more useful in this scenario, because only true infiltration will get you all the way out toward the furthest most supply boxes from your deployment zone, but some forward deployment is totally fine. And so we have 2 Strelocks, 1 mine layer, 1 forward observer. The mine layer, if I had been going first, would definitely be attempting to do a smash and grab. Sorry, the forward observer, if I'd been going first, would be attempting to do a smash and grab on the near supply box. In this case, he's going to have to do something else because, spoiler alert, I won't win the lieutenant role. But the mine layer will do a stellar job kind of holding down that central area. Now, I did originally intend to have 3 Strelocks in this list, but I had a sure feet of spare SWC, and I went looking for things that I could take for 17 points, and I stumbled across what is not necessarily a fantastic pick, but which would end up being absolutely pivotal this game, a Tractable Courier. Now, someone did actually send me a video quite recently from some Eastern European lad with very big opinions about how to construct lists in Infinity. And while I admit I haven't gotten around to watching it yet, my understanding, kind of just getting the gist from how people have spoken about it, is that apparently it's rule number 1 to always include guided in lists. Now, that is not something I personally agree with for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think guided just has very, very diminishing returns in N5. I think it is far too risk prone to ever be something like your first order of attack. It is extremely easy over the course of like a 3 or 5 round event, if you are trying to make guided work, to just toilet bowl entire turns, mostly because of how reset works as a face-to-face role now, but there have been a bunch of small changes to guided that have led up to that in terms of the effect it's had in N5. I just don't think guided needs to be in lists much at all anymore, but kind of more than that, the idea of strict rules for list construction, any kind of absolute statement, is just not a great idea. It's very foolish to deal in absolutes or axioms. It is always better from time to time to reapproach things from first principles, to be flexible in your thinking, to be able to learn new lessons when they are provided to you, and even just to try new and novel things from time to time, which in this case means that we have slammed guided fire into an Ariadnan list. Now, that is actually something I have spoken about in previous videos, and how you can kind of make guided work in Ariadna if you are also taking a bunch of forward observers. But I also wanted it because, one, deployment zone mine layers in this scenario, where you have a part of your deployment zone you are trying to protect, right? The safe area that you are delivering supplies back to. One deployment zone mine layer actually is kind of useful there, and so is a total reaction bot. And as much as the Tractor Mule Courier is like kind of a meme, it's doing all of those things. It also has quite forgiving range bands, right? It has very long 0 range bands, and I'm taking 2 engineers to repair other things in this list, so I may as well just double down on the remote presence repairable elements. And yes, the other things that we are taking engineers to repair are a pair of Vistrals. Now, whether the Vistral is a good piece or not is like a bit mixed in terms of, it's a neurokinetics piece, and neurokinetics pieces are always, almost by definition, purely defensive. It's very difficult to take offensive attacks with them, although I will this game on one occasion. And locking points into purely defensive pieces does very much limit your flexibility. But if ever there was a scenario in which the Vistral is really, really well suited, it's in exactly this scenario for two reasons. The first reason is that provisioning is a sniper ranged band scenario, and having defensive sniper rifles just far exceeds any other kind of defensive weapon because you will have such a long +3 range band that you can use Sapper to deploy really far back, make maximal use of it, even more than you would in a regular deployment scenario. The other reason is that Sapper is inherently very valuable in weird deployment zone scenarios generally. Not because you are guaranteed to have a bad deployment zone, but because it is absolutely a risk. The simple fact of the matter is that we as players are going to have almost zero practice setting up tables for radial deployment zones. So we will be just kind of inherently likely to whoopsie make a bad deployment zone. But even beyond that, this is something that we see with scenarios like Power Pack, where if you're a TO and you are running an event and players come in and they set up their tables, people just default to setting up deployment zones that facilitate serviceable deployment zones for standard 12-inch deep table deployments. And so inevitably, when people talk about their experiences with scenarios like Power Pack, and I expect it to be exactly the same scenarios like provisioning, you will get a small selection of games that are absolute horror stories because just not really thinking about it, people who set the tables up didn't put any relevant terrain in those parts of the table that you all of a sudden find yourself constrained to deploying within. Biotech War is often kind of a bad experience for some people for the same reason, where you just have people not putting enough terrain in the back 8 inches of the deployment zone, and so it just being an absolute nightmare to try and deploy your army. And I expect absolutely the same thing, right, to happen in people's experiences, particularly the first time people play provisioning in a scenario like a tournament environment. And for a selection of people that will probably be at Interplanetario, it is really, really easy to just accidentally, as a TO, screw up terrain for a scenario like this. And so, having a pair of total reaction, or sorry, neurokinetic defensive pieces with Sapper is just insurance against the worst happening in that respect. This list generally actually only has to deploy safely a very small number of models because so much of the list is being thrown out with forward deployment and infiltration, and then two of the other most important pieces have Sapper. I can be relatively flexible with my selection of deployment zone because of all of these concessions I am making. Now, do I think this is a good list generally? Fuck no! This list has a single active turn gun that isn't an Ohotnik. This list is tailored exclusively for the scenario that I'm about to play with it, but it is tailored exclusively for the scenario I'm about to play with it. And I think if we see more scenarios with with forward observer specialist bonuses, and even potentially if we see more scenarios making use of radial deployments, these things are kind of good for Ariadne. I don't know if they will herald the end of Ariadne's short winter in N5, but with a bit of inventiveness from Ariadne players, they certainly won't hurt. So that's my artillery park meme of a list. Let's jump into the Kestrel Colonial Force list I will be playing against. Now, this list was kind of designed on very similar principles to mine. It is being played by someone who is not by default a Kestrel Colonial Force player, but who looked at this scenario and went, snipers could be good. And in that vein, we have a double multi-sniper rifle list, including the dreaded Black Air FTO. Now, first up, we have just a very solid and serviceable Harris team. We have the Griffin HMG, by Pandra with Tactical Awareness, and a Firefly Engineer and DD Activator. I really like this as a team. I like that you can leave the Firefly behind if you need to, and it keeps duo bonuses. And the Griffin, obviously, my opponent did not know that he was going to be playing against Ariadne, but the Griffin is an MSV1 Ballistic Skill 14 gunfighter, and very, very good in the matchup and generally. This is just a nice team, and by Pandra as a doctor gives you some extra resiliency in terms of doing things like making sure the Griffin stays active. We then have a 5-person Fusilier team, 2 regular combi rifle Fennecs, one of whom is the lieutenant, 1 paramedic, 1 forward observer with disco baller, which is going to be a really big addition to the list in this particular game, and the Black Air FTO. Now, the Black Air FTO is a piece that I find very feast or famine. He is actually a dangerous enough gunfighter to sometimes be able to take active turn fights even with neurokinetics, but most of the time you are kind of set having him be purely reactive. And for all the same reasons as neurokinetics on a Vistral can be like a little bit of an issue in terms of the limitations it imposes on your list, so much air is being occupied by the Black Air FTO in this list, right? 5 troopers in this list, and all of the points that they cost, including the cost of the Black Air itself, are functionally dedicated to a defensive role. That's going to sharply limit your offensive potential, but the payoff is that you have the Black Air FTO. And much in the same way as a Vistral is a really good use of like a use of points and the troop slot because of what it does in this scenario, yeah, by God, the Black Air is incredible in this specific scenario because those multi-sniper range bands can be reliably obtained and exploited. On top of that, I'm playing Ariadna. I have zero access to Eclipse Smoke, so that thing is going to be a goddamn nightmare. We then have a Fugazi Dronbot and Dr. Harper. Now, at this point, I feel like it's a compulsory part of service in the Kestrel Colonial Force that at some point every Kestrel player has to at least try Dr. Harper out and come to the conclusion that she's not worth 35 points. Now, she would actually do some very cool stuff this game, and she will give the extra SWC that will enable a 6.5 SWC list, but Jesus, 35 points is so very, very expensive. I don't personally recommend her unless you are trying to do something funny and a little bit of a meme. She is an enabler for that. Probably avoid her in tournament lists, but this game is a one-shot trying out a new scenario, and so, hey, the hell with it, let's see how she does. Then in Combat Group 2, we have Nauf. Now, Nauf is another piece that, in general, I would not expect to see in Kestrel Colonial Force. There are just other pieces, especially that you could spend the SWC on, but also the points. It's not too many more points to turn Nauf into a Griffin, and even a Griffin Feuerback is likely to get better performance than he does. Except again, this is a sniper mission, and he's a +1 burst native MSV1 mimetism multi-sniper. You are going to be able to get the range bands for him, and so I think this is probably a very rare case of Nauf actually being justified, and he would cause me no end of pain. Now, the rest of this group is basically just a defensive package. We have a Warcore, we have a Scarecrow Mine Layer, we have a Sierra Johnbot, and we have a Jackal. All of these are really solid in this scenario. Just a couple of Mine Layers helps you either zone out or set up defenses around any of the objectives in this scenario. Infiltration in particular is really useful because it lets you reach the really far supply boxes, and like I just have endless amounts of time for that 11-point Jackal. It's just always going to be cool and useful. This is just a solid defensive combat group, well suited to the requirements of this scenario, and if it needs to spend some orders, it can spend a few orders on Nauf taking long-range gunshots, it can spend a few orders with the Scarecrow, maybe taking some face-to-face rolls or going and attacking things. And if all else fails, it can spend some orders on the Jackal spec firing. So I think this is a list that is also quite highly adapted to this particular scenario. And while I definitely think that, look, cut Priya Harper, turn the HMG Sierra into a Thunderbolt to save the SWC, and you have a ton of points to play with to do other stuff. But otherwise, this is a list that is extremely well suited to provisioning. Let's see how it did. Now, here we have our table, Willpower 12 Lieutenant versus Willpower 14, but I tragically lose the roll. I would very much have liked to have gone first, but second is fine. We have certain defensive pieces, and I have elected to set up second in the top table quarter, up here. My opponent is therefore deploying in the bottom table quarter, and his deployment zone is going to be something like this. Now, as noted, that's a fair amount of depth to play with, but not actually a terribly large amount of space. It's approximately commensurate to an 8-inch deployment zone in terms just of sheer real estate, but it does have depth to play with. So for example, if you're playing this scenario and you were to deploy a model all the way back here, for example, it would be mostly very safe against direct attacks because there is just so much distance your opponent would have to cover to reach this model that it is probably quite safe from any kind of conventional attack. However, one of the things that you do have to be careful of in scenarios like this is that your opponent can deploy infiltrators all the way out here and here, which then can have straight line runs toward the flanks of your deployment zone. And so you really do have to think about your defenses as facing in all directions. Now, my opponent in this case is reasonably well covered because he has a black air facing basically straight forward, which means that it's also covering all of the flanks, and I am not sure I'm ever going to be able to kill that thing in a direct gunfight. And so, in terms of deployment, we have the Fusilier fire team is hanging out on and behind this building. The Black Air is in a dominant position, watching an awful lot of the table. Now we are playing these trees as solid, but it still has a pretty mean cross-table line there, and a pretty mean cross-table line up here, which means that it is covering two of the three objectives, not all of them, happily. And again, it's going to be just very dominant in ARO. The war correspondent is on picket duty back here, watching up this direction. And I will note that although it's not quite visible in this picture, there's a bunch of like scatter back here that is keeping the Fusiliers hanging out behind this building in good safe positions. This is a difficult position to attack. On top of the rooftop, we have the Total Reaction HMG up here, and we have the two specialist Fusiliers, the Disco Ball and the Paramedic. The Fugazi Dronbot is hanging out behind these trees, watching across the table this way. You have quite long range bands, zero range bands on a flash pulse. Sorry, not zero, but you have quite long range bands on a flash pulse. The -3 goes for a long way. And so it's doing good work as a picket piece there. Nauf is on this rooftop up here, and then the three-person Haris is in this triangle here, with Bipandra, the Firefly, and then the HMG Griffin quite forward deployed. This is a good position for it because it's got the capacity to move out in either of these directions, and that gives it the best possible chance at being able to take a 32-inch range band fight. For example, any of these three barricades, any model standing directly behind them, would have been within 32 inches, so the Griffin is making full use of the forward positioning that can be enabled by the 24-inch radial deployment. Apart from that, the Jackal is on this rooftop with his mine down behind these trees, and the Scarecrow's mine is deployed here, covering this objective. The Scarecrow himself is just hanging out nearby. Dr. Harper will end up being forward deployed somewhere down here, ready to run on this objective, and that's the entirety of my opponent's deployment. We can see his safe area here, the same way my safe area is here. Both just kind of, this was really the only realistic place that we could put something. In my case, I've actually got quite a congested deployment zone, so I wanted the relatively further forward position on my safe zone. In my opponent's case, this is just close to all three of the supply boxes, and so easy to drop supplies back off into. Now, for my part, I have two reserve drops. Both of my reserve drops will be the Vestral units, and so everything else is deploying during the regular deployment point. Now, the intention had been originally to have each of the three forward observer, infiltrating, or forward deploying specialists deployed in position to go after one of the buttons and then ideally bring them back towards my deployment zone. I didn't win first turn, and so we had to adopt a reactive and defensive posture instead. And so we have kind of weighted one flank. What we have in terms of the forward positioned elements is the Strelok mine layer is hanging out in this area with a decoy, the Strelok himself, and then the mine here. Now the mine had to be positioned very carefully. I could not position it to detonate on my opponent's mine here, but I am able to cover basically the entirety of this objective without risking detonation onto this mine. That would have been illegal under the mine layer rules, but I do have a shock mine that is set up to mess with anyone who comes after this objective. We then have the first of two mine layers, mine layer scouts. The scout itself is here, the mine is up here behind this building, and it's looking to do a couple of things. The first thing is that the Ochotnik itself threatens all of this space here, so anything that is coming through this direction, or possibly even going onto this objective, is at risk from the Ochotnik, and then the EM mine itself, of course, is protecting the objective back here. We have also put the second forward of the forward observer Strelok down behind this big helicopter here, ready to run out and grab the objective. Because I deemed that objective to be safest, it would be most difficult for my opponent to get, and because I basically needed to put a bunch of other stuff over here in this position. And so over in this corner, we have the other three scouts. So we have the mine layer scout and its mine covering this objective, and then we have both forward observers kind of up and around here on top of the rooftop and behind. And so there we can see here, they are making full use of infiltration to go a really long way away from most of the concentration of my opponent's forces, ready to project threat down any of these lines. And it was the scouts I had to put in these positions just because forward deployment 8 wasn't going to get either of my Strelocks there. The Strelocks are constrained to positions relatively close to my deployment zone. The scouts go all the way out on the wings. Otherwise, in terms of inside my deployment, behind this building here, on the second level of this building, we have the Tractor Mule Courier. Its mine is deployed down here, watching my safe zone, and the Courier itself is watching basically up this angle, using its total reaction powers to cover this objective. The sniper team and Veronin are all going to be hanging out way in the rear with the gear, although I do have the sniper watching a kind of long angle where he's only going to be exposed to, he won't be exposed to Nauf. Nauf can't see him from there even if it leans out. The Griffin would be able to see if it moved all the way up and around, but only at a bad range band. My opponent then drops down Priya Harper as his reserve, and I drop down my 2 couriers. Now, I definitely make, so my 2 Vistrals. Now, I definitely make a mistake here. Having thought about it and having played the game out, I should absolutely have used the Vistrals to just bracket the hell out of the Black Air. It can potentially fight in active turn 1 Vistral. It's got Mimetism and an MSV, and so the fact that it's really only rolling 1 dice and 1 special die, it can just win enough face-to-face rolls, put enough DA rounds into the 2 wound Vistral to put it down. But if I'm watching the Black Air with 2 Vistrals, it's done. It just cannot fight that, right? You put 1 die and 1 special die into a single Vistral, and the other one gets unopposed shots on 9s, and 2 dice on 9s with an extra damage AP sniper rifle is just not something that you're willing to risk, particularly given that you probably have to take that fight a couple of times to actually reliably put even the first of 2 Vistrals down. And so while I was quite conservative with the Vistrals this game, I should not have been. I should have had one like up on this rooftop, one a bit further out and around, just pinning this motherfucker down, because as long as the Black Air is pinned down, doing anything with the rest of the Fusilier fire team would be difficult. And that's going to be really important because despite all of the reactive firepower that I have, my opponent has Disco. And that is basically going to be the tail of the tape for the first round. Because the Black Air is not in any way suppressed, my opponent is going to be able to move the Disco Fusilier around and place 2 Disco Balls to enable relatively clean maneuver. The first one is going to be shot to cover this area down here, which is going to mean that this Vistral that is watching up this line here will no longer have line of sight. The second one is going to be shot approximately down here to mean the same thing from this Vistral, and that is going to enable Dr. Harper to move up and around, succeed her roll to grab this box. She will actually trigger the EM mine, but she just tanks 2 hits. Now, that's not actually hugely unlikely. She needs something like 12s to pass those because she has a nano screen, and nano screens do actually, they're fully effective against template weapons. And so she needs to roll something like 12s to actually pass that. She just tanks the 2 12s, is not isolated, and then proceeds on her merry way back to this space here into her safe zone where she will drop prone. She won't actually drop the objective off, you don't strictly speaking need to, but she will do that with a tactical awareness order in a subsequent turn. Now, that's a really clean line of play for my opponent, and it would still have been possible, but it would have been much more difficult to enact if I had been pinning down the Black Air with the 2 Vistrals. My opponent would have had to have broken the link team, and then reformed it with just the Fusiliers, spending a command token, and then if he wanted a linked Black Air, he would have needed to reform it again in a subsequent turn or order at the end of the turn, basically. That would have been an impost of 2 command tokens just to pull the same trick, which is an awful lot. Like, that would stress your command token pool down to just a single command token, which could have big knock-on effects for the rest of the game. As it was, though, I didn't have my opponent pinned down. I had made a mistake in my deployment. I was not sufficiently aggressive, and so this was just a really clean line of play. And with 1 supply box and plenty of orders to spare, with 1 supply box completely controlled, under his control in his safe zone, I was now going to be kind of up against it in terms of trying to accomplish anything for the rest of the game. I would have to race against that score. The pressure would be on me to disrupt the status quo, and this is kind of a difficult scenario to do that in. Now, my opponent has plenty of orders left, and so he's going to take some different moves. The first thing he'd like to do, ideally, is to come after this supply box, because if he can secure that supply box, he's in fantastic shape, right? If he has 2 supply boxes back in his safe area, the game is not necessarily as good as 1, but it is certainly difficult for me. And so the first thing to do is to try and solve the ongoing AROs the Pan-Oceanian way. No problem, out comes the Griffin, and takes a look at this Vistral over here. Now, I mentioned that the Griffin was well deployed. It would have line of sight, so it would have line of sight and good range to any of the things behind these barricades here. However, because of Sapper, this Vistral is actually about an inch beyond the furthest most barricade, which puts it at about 32.5 inches from the Griffin. There is a subsequent face-to-face roll, and although the Griffin's MSV does serve it well against Sapper, the poor range band does not. He takes a hit and subsequently takes a wound from the extra damage AP sniper rifle that the Vistral is packing. Now, that isn't the end of the world, but with that range band revealed, he's absolutely not going to take that face-to-face roll again, and so this link team begins to move out and around this way. However, because this is probably a mine, it's pretty clearly telegraphed, my opponent decides that he first needs to just deal with this mine before he tries to run by Pandra in there, and that's sensible. And so out the Scarecrow comes from hiding, walks in this direction and dodges. Yep, because it's a mine, the mine detonates. It's a real mine, not an EM mine. The Scarecrow dodges and succeeds the dodge. However, then something happens we need to make a ruling on, because the mine's template clips and destroys the disco ball. Now, it is not 100% clear from the rules of the disco ball whether or not the smoke stays in place until the end of the turn if the disco itself is destroyed. It's very, very difficult to destroy the disco baller in reactive because it's in the middle of an eclipse zone. But I mine detonating is one of the ways to do it. We go through the rules, we read, and my observation is that all of the wording around disco balls refers to the disco ball itself deactivating at end of round, causing the zone to disappear. And so it seems, based on my wording, that the zero visibility zone generated by the disco ball is connected to the disco ball itself, and the destruction or deactivation of the disco ball causes the zone to go away. And so the way that we play it is not the same as we would say a zero visibility zone caused by a smoke grenade, which just expires naturally in the states phase. The disco ball being destroyed by the mine causes the zero visibility zone itself to disappear. And that basically ends the turn for my opponent, because the Scarecrow is in the open, it can't move, it's been pinned down by this Vistral and it will be shot. And any kind of a clean run over the remainder of this turn on this area is not going to happen. My opponent is not willing to expose the Griffin to further face-to-face rolls from another Vistral. The range bands that he would have from this position here is probably fine. That's probably totally okay for the Griffin, but it's down to a single wound now, and it's just too much of a risk and not really worth it. So my opponent basically does what we might call some housekeeping things. Right, like the Jackal places a mind behind it because my opponent is aware of the fact that something could come up onto this rooftop and shoot him in the back. So the Jackal just gets a mind to protect itself. Other pieces move around, get back into position, and my opponent basically hunkers down in the knowledge that he's gotten one objective, gotten back, and is in actually just a fine scenario position, and will have full bottle of orders to play out all of his subsequent turns. This is just a good, solid, clean first turn. One objective secured, and it's now on me to try and solve the game state. And solving the game state as it happens is going to be a bit of a bastard, because I am dealing with cross-hatching AROs from Nauf and the Black Air Sniper and the Griffin, all of which have MSVs against my entire army of Mimetism 3, and most of which have extremely favorable range bands. So, my decision, like after looking at all of the different angles, etc., I do not under any circumstances want to fight the Black Air. The only thing in my list that has even a chance in hell is the Frontovic, and even that, frankly, is not good. But the Frontovic can take a fight against Nauf, and if I can deal with Nauf, certain options open up. So the Kazakh fire team moves out. They come up to a doorway in this building, prone up onto the roof, and after 2 orders of maneuver, I get into a position where the Frontovic sniper can stand up here, engage Nauf, and he takes a 3 dice on 12 versus 1 dice on 13's fight against Nauf, and gets shot and dies. Now, that's a little unlucky, but it can absolutely happen, and that's my only active turn gun dead. Little bit of an issue with the list. Now, I am planning on making plenty of face-to-face rolls with Ohotniks. That's part of the point of this list. I have theoretically 4 other active turn guns if I can just get them into good positions, but I don't really want them to fight Nauf, ideally not. Still, we'll give it at least one crack, and the scout that is in this corner up here just pulls back behind the building. He is in some kind of scary line of sight. He's in line of sight of the Griffin up here, and of Nauf, and of Bipandra. Now he moves, and Bipandra declares discover, the Griffin holds, and Nauf holds. And because the Griffin is, like, I'm going to try and push my luck a little bit here. I think this is objectively a mistake, but I actually reveal because a free shot is a free shot and will take out Bipandra and impose some significant limitations on my opponent. And so I shoot Bipandra and I shoot Nauf to impose surprise. Now what happens is the Griffin swings and miss. Fantastic. Bipandra survives the hit and guts behind cover, and Nauf crits me, which puts this scout down. Now, I probably shouldn't have taken that face-to-face roll with the scout. As it turns out, this is terrible range in any case. The scout only has good range out to 32. He's in 0 range band. Nauf is in cover and Mimetism. Nauf has an MSV1. This was just a bad face-to-face roll. With surprise, I had a shot. No, Nauf just rolled a 10 and crit me. I am now down two significant pieces. My opponent has taken no casualties and is sitting on a box. And I genuinely sit there being like, I think I've lost the game at this point. And I go into the tank for a good, like, 5 minutes. My opponent actually says, oh, hey, if you're going to do a battle report on this, do you want to just, like, wind that back or say one of those was inconclusive? But, like, I'm like, no, let me look for it. And the only thing I can think to do is to spool up the career and take some spec fire shots. But I've got speculative fire in the list, and you play your outs. And 2 orders of spec fire later, Nauf is dead. The Uragan has reasonably forgiving range bans, and so it just puts those shots over onto Nauf's head from downrange, and on the second shot, it crits and kills him. And with Nauf dead, I now have considerably more flexibility to take engagements in this space. And so the second of 3 scouts that I have hanging out down here, the one that's this direction, the first thing that he does is he peeks just half an inch this way and then moves forward, takes a fight against the war correspondent and kills it. Then it peeks out and around to see the Griffin, takes the fight against the Griffin and kills it. And those are T2 rounds, by the way, so he is all the way dead. And then it comes around a little further to see the Scarecrow and kills it. And so a turn that literally was me being like, I think I'm dead. Like, unless I can kill Nauf, I think I have lost the game. Oh, well, Specfire it is. And Specfire bailed me the hell out. And that's the thing, right? You play your outs. And so a game, like, I am still losing, right? In the strictest sense. I have lost some important resources on my first turn, and my opponent is up on scenario, and I had killed nothing, but now, actually, I have killed multiple of the most important pieces, and now all of my opponent's active turn guns, apart from a Sierra Total Reaction bot, are dead. So this game flipped on a dime from a position where I was like, do I just lose? No, well, let's roll some Specfire, and that Specfire absolutely bailed me out. Now, would I have been in a better position if the Frontovic had just won his damn face-to-face roll and killed Nauf? Yes, absolutely. That didn't happen. That's a thing that doesn't happen when you're playing with single wound troops sometimes. We went for the chip in a chair play. We were rewarded. I had, I think, 4 orders to make that attack. Yep, I'll take it. And so play proceeded. Otherwise, the only thing that happened was that I had the Strelok mine layer here just peek out to lay another mine. I had the feeling that would be important. And then I passed turn back to my opponent. And so my opponent here is definitely under pressure, but still in a winning position if they can keep the game under control. They still have very, very strong, near insurmountable defensive pieces, and they have 1 box and I have none. So the goal for them here this turn is just going to be to secure a second one of those boxes, because that will put them in a very strong position. Now, they have no baggage in this list, so they nominally can't place any more disco, except Speedball. They call down a Speedball with Overkill, which enables a troop to reload. Now, it does fail the landing, but it will just come in off the table edge here, which will enable the Fusilier Forward Observer to just pop back down over the building, pick it up, pop back up onto the building, reload himself, and then place down. It takes 2 orders, actually misses the first one, because he does have to long bomb it, but place down a disco here. And it needs to be fairly aggressively positioned because it has to enable like block line of sight from multiple different pieces, because I have 2 different Vistrals. One of them is watching up this direction, one of them is watching up this direction. Nevertheless, that is sufficient, and so then it's Priya and the Firefly who come up and around, and after a fair bit of finagling, basically what needs to happen is that they need to sort of like come around this direction. The Firefly actually picks up a jump pack from the second disco ball, and he has to maneuver up and around this way. He actually takes shots from, I think, both, or like he takes shots from the first Vistral, while Bipandra comes around this way, because what needs to happen is that the Firefly needs to detonate the mine that I've placed here, but not by approaching from this direction. Because if Bipandra and the Firefly both approach from this direction, and the Firefly moves forward first and detonates the mine, what is going to happen? The mine template is going to once again take out the disco ball. And so instead, the Firefly comes all like he circumnavigates up and around here, grabs the jetpack, and then zooms around this direction so that the mine detonates this way, doesn't blow up the precious, precious smoke. He dies, but that enables Bipandra to come around here, just hug the edge of the smoke, pick up the objective, and then run back and around, so that there are now 2, under Kestrel Colonial Force command, 2 different objectives sitting in this zone. Bipandra and Priya are both going to be sitting here with 2 objectives, with basically everything now resting on the black air to keep me thoroughly at arm's length. Now, I have a few things to accomplish this turn, one of which is I need to do some of the damn scenario. And so the critical thing this turn is that the forward observer Strelok hanging out back here makes his way around, grabs this objective, and then makes his way back. 2 dice on 16s, no problem, and he will end up sitting comfortably behind this aircraft, ready to run around this direction in a subsequent turn. In fact, no, I tell a lie. He actually made that run previous turn. I did have one box that was under my control, just not in my deployment zone. So sorry, he spends the orders this turn, running all the way around here, so that next turn someone can jump over and get it into the safe zone. So that's what happens. So we have one box under our control. At the end of this turn, it's going to be basically hanging out back here. I can't run in this direction because there is a black air and I will die. But we get all the way down and around to here, ready to run into the zone safely because we can cross this line here without being seen by the black air. So we can get at least one box in our zone at the end of the round. End of the game, rather. The rest of this turn involves the one remaining camouflage scout up here being an absolute psycho. He takes the door down and begins walking in this direction, comes up and around this way, and proceeds to kill everything. He takes a fight with Bipandra and kills her. He takes a fight with Priya and kills her. T2 rounds, remember, so no winning cap is useless. The total reaction bot succeeds a dodge to come out and try and pin him down, takes a shot with the silenced pistol at good range and kills it. Then proceeds up and along here to engage one of these Fusiliers, hoping it's Lieutenant, silence pistol at short range and kills it. And at this point, two different possible futures can occur. One in which my opponent actually does suggest and allow a takeback, and one in which it doesn't. The problem is, in one of these two futures, I proceed along to get line of sight to the other Fusilier, and I kill it as well. This is the future that does not actually happen for purposes of this battle report, because killing that Fusilier is the difference between my opponent having something like 79 and 69 points going into their third round. This is a scenario that ends in retreat, and so one hypothetical timeline involves a single scout kicking my opponent's ass so badly that he goes into retreat and immediately ends the game with a major victory. In the other alternate timeline, I do some quick retreat math prior to making the utterly terminal run into my opponent's lieutenant, and instead, recognizing, for the purpose of this battle report, that doing so will put my opponent into retreat, pull back and recamouflage. Now, that is a violent fucking turn for my opponent, but he still has two boxes in the safe zone. They don't have to have models in base contact with them. As long as they are in the safe zone, they are under his control. And so the remainder of his entire final turn, he has something like 5 orders, involves using the sensor on the forward observer sensor disco ball Fennec Fusilier to ferret out and annihilate this scout that is hanging out back here, and then fling Fusiliers around into as aggressively forward positions as he can in order to just hold for the remainder of the game, because if the game ends with him having 2 boxes in this zone and me only having 1 in mine, he is going to win. And so in this position here, we can see the black air is still in position watching the entire table, basically. We have the 2 Fennec Fusiliers who have jumped down and taken up these forward positions, and then that's basically it. That's just about the entirety of my opponent's entire force at this point. He nominally actually is in retreat at this stage due to casualties sustained during his turn, but that's neither here nor there and not important. Retreat's only checked at the beginning of the turn, so we proceed through my last round of play. And this last turn is going to require some really extreme, ed level order, planning, because this is really, really challenging to try and figure out. I have sustained losses myself. I do not have infinite resources to spend, and the depth of this scenario is going to be a challenge. Now, I can't really, there is a scout still hanging out back here. This is the one that killed the Griffin and the Scarecrow. It can't really move, because right now, it is securing the HVT. Aaron's HVT, that's my opponent for this game, is hanging out back here, and nothing else is in position to secure that. And my plan to try and win this game is just to get one supply box out of this zone and score my classified by the securing the HVT. But getting even one box out of this zone is going to be very challenging. However, we have a plan, and it is just barely going to work. So after about 5 or 6 minutes of cooking this out, I move the forward observer Strelok into the first combat group. From there, we impetuous forward the Ermandino that is back here. She'll impetuous forward to here. The Strelok will then activate and double move forward to be just in front of the Ermandino. The Ermandino will then spend her irregular order, move past the Strelok, pick up the box, and she will end up holding the box inside the safe area. Cool, I now have, at the cost of just one impetuous and one irregular, and one regular, I have a box in the safe area. Excellent. Next, the Strelok is going to recamouflage, move up and around here, and then start making this run. Now, this is a Strelok forward observer. My opponent is aware of the fact that it can potentially move all the way up to here, jump over and back and grab a box, and even if it dies, it can carry the box out of his safe area with that play. And so the black air at long range declares discover. And so I respond with some Ariadnan tactics and declare forward observer. One of the forward observer rolls hits, which means it's guided missile time, baby! Up spools the Uragan, lands a shot directly on the black air's head, and kills it. Now, was that a likely face-to-face roll? Yeah. Wasn't terrible. The black air's not that high willpower. It was something like 1 dice 14s to 1 dice 9s. But you play your outs, and once again, the courier tractor mule has saved the game for me. With the black air down, I basically do like a quick order count, and it's going to be incredibly dicey. So what we do is we use our own speed pool, and we call down a jetpack, and it lands. And so the Strelok walks over the jetpack, picks it up, and only by dint of the jetpack is it able to make a 6-inch move over and back, picking up this objective. It gets shot by both of the Fusiliers and it dies, but it succeeds picking up the objective. The objective is placed in base contact with it, and then at resolution of the order, it dies, dropping the objective outside of anyone's control. And that means that at the end of the game, I have 1 box in my safe area. My opponent has 1 box in his safe area. 1 is uncontrolled in no man's land, and I have secured the HVT. That puts the final score at an incredibly anemic 3 points to 2, but a win is a win. God, I had to absolutely scrape for it, especially after that first turn where I just lost 2 models in the first face-to-face rolls, but we got there. Now, do I think this is a good scenario? Actually, yes, with the really big caveat that I don't think it is going to be well received by many people the first time they play it. It is pretty much an axiom at this stage that wargamers hate only 2 things, change and the way things are, and this scenario, because of how it plays, is going to feel alien and uncomfortable to basically everyone the first time they approach it. And that is going to upset their expectations and make them feel bad. And you will absolutely have cases where people play on it on tables that are not well set up for the game, and then just get terrible experiences from deployment zones. And so my general expectation is to see a tremendous amount of complaining about this scenario, especially like the first few times people play it. But I do think it's really cool and interesting. There are things that happen with radial deployment that make the game very different in terms of opportunities that arise, right? The game is absolutely full of like shrouded snipers, for example, which are just profiles that you would never pick, but you actually kind of might in this case. Another thing that was really interesting is that because this halfway line is so long, right, because it's 69 inches, no, I will not stop making a reference as to that specific distance. You actually have a huge amount of real estate to make use specifically with infiltrators. And there's also a really material difference between true infiltration and just forward deployment. Because like just forward deployment it has a lot of luxury. You can still forward deploy like in this position, you can forward deploy here really easily. You can get to within like 1 inch of the halfway line. You can almost, I think you can just about forward deploy in contact with the objective marker, because the objective marker itself occupies space. I could forward deploy behind this helicopter, for example, but only true infiltration can make use of the absolute extremes of the table edge, but it can make use of the absolute extremes of the table edge. And so infiltration is really valuable. It has a forward observer specialist bonus, which is something that we just haven't otherwise seen in official ITS scenarios, but by God is it a boon for Ariadne especially, which is one of the only factions to have reliable access to forward observers. Like those are its primary specialists in the midfield. Other factions tend to make use of forward deploying or infiltrating hackers because those serve other uses. And even the deployment zones themselves, the main 24-inch deployment zones, I find really interesting because, as I mentioned, your actual physical real estate is relatively limited, but you have tremendous depth, right? You have, strictly speaking, a 24-inch deep deployment zone, which means that things that are as far back as possible, provided they aren't exposed to enfilade fire from the table edges, are hugely safe. You can actually just put yourself out of range of enemy missile launchers. You can be absolutely safe from guided fire if you make maximal use of the distance and the depth that you have. And so that's really interesting. And all of this stuff is really, really cool, provided, and it comes with the really big caveat that firstly, we as players learn how to play the scenario, and secondly, we as players and as tournament organizers build tables that are fun to play for the scenario. That's my genuine concern for Interplanetario. I genuinely suspect that we will get reports back from Interplanetario of just mildly haphazardly put together tables, not as a sledge of Corvus Belli, just because that's the kind of thing that invariably happens in big events. It's very hard to really carefully curate tables. When you have, what, like 50 or 100 or whatever players, it's very hard to carefully curate all of those tables. And this is a scenario that demands careful curation of the table for both players to have a good time. And I think if we as a community, and then Corvus Belli running into Planetario, can overcome those specific caveats, this is the first time I have ever seen something like a radial deployment work in a way that was not a hot mess. I actually really enjoyed this. I thought it was really cool. We both played lists that were at least a little bit different, and I kind of want to play this scenario again. I do think, in a weird way, despite the fact that it isn't an exclusion zone, right? There's no special prohibitions in this list. It is a list that it's a scenario that you want to kind of build for a little bit. But it was pretty cool and pretty interesting, and I would be keen to play it again. Now, for now, that wraps up this video. It's going to be coming out quite soon. Normally, I aim for one video a week, but we'll put out two this week just because I think Strike While the Iron is hot. This is a new scenario, and I thought people would be interested in my experiences with it. That means we are going to aim for another Infinity video next weekend, which I hope you'll stick around for and see. Otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. If you want to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Otherwise, hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.